back has this coined this doha for it. देख अंग्रेजी के अक्षर, भागे मलेरिया के मच्छर. The malaria mosquitoes, just upon seeing English birds on the walls, they will flee. So in the same way, we are being told today by our own university that if you have a piece of paper with you that says this mystifying category called B.Tech Humanities, you will suddenly get a job. That the market will respond to this piece of paper, and like magic, you will have a job. You don't need me to tell you that this is rubbish. This is nonsense. That this kind of a talisman, this kind of a talisman is not going to work. So my first point really is this, that even when taken at face value, the instrumental side of education is failing us today as instrumental education. Let us at least have good instrumental education, and that is not there. The second aspect I want to talk about are the utilitarian reasons or the instrumental reasons to value non-instrumental knowledge, or what I'm calling useless knowledge. There are many good, hard-headed instrumental reasons to value what might not be immediately useful. Perhaps the best and most enduring of these reasons is that usefulness itself is time-bound, is context-bound. So that what is useful today may not be useful tomorrow. Or in other words, we have no idea of knowing what will be useful tomorrow. So if we don't know what will be useful tomorrow, it's foolish to fix on a particular set of skills or a particular set of knowledges as being useful before the fact. So in other words, even from a purely instrumental point of view, even if you wish to teach only useful knowledge, it makes sense to keep the ambit of the useful loose, with very weak boundaries, keep this category very porous, so that lots of different things can be included in it, so that you don't paint yourself into a corner when tomorrow finally comes and you know what is the form of usefulness that is going to work in that context. There are also many other hard-headed questions that can be asked about the opposite of uselessness. That is to say, about notions of useful. Useful for whom? One of the primary assumptions behind the idea of vocational education is that it is meant to be useful for employers, not necessarily for employees. So future employees have to be taught what will be useful for employers. And there are surely many areas of this knowledge where this conflict of interest can assume significant proportions. That is to say, students are not taught what they ought to know, and that might not necessarily be in the interests of their employers. So in this sense, we need to ask useful for whom. I've already brought up this question of useful when. Because if it is useful today, there's no guarantee that it will be useful tomorrow. And finally, probably the most diffuse aspect of this, useful in what way? What exactly do we mean by useful? Because the most, from my point of view, and having spoken to some employers, I believe this is their point of view as well, that the most valued attribute in employees in very stellar organizations, very sought after organizations, is precisely adaptability, teachability, the ability to adjust to radically new circumstances very quickly, very efficiently. And this kind of an ability requires the sorts of skills that cannot really be straight-jacketed in a course for which there can be coaching classes, for which there can be textbooks, and then a subsidiary textbooks, others, second-order textbooks explaining that textbook and so on. That entire industry just simply doesn't work. So purely instrumental ways of looking at it, you can make an argument for so-called useless knowledge that needs to be defended. Finally, there are this set of reasons to defend useless knowledge that where it sees useless knowledge as an end in itself, not in instrumental terms, but as an end in itself. And this is what you often hear about in terms of liberal education, in terms of critical thinking, all of these things. There is unfortunately a sense, there's a tenor or a flavor to these discussions which makes this appear as some kind of a luxury, as something that only the quote-unquote rich in some sense, not necessarily only in a purely economic sense, can afford. It's not for everyone. It's an extra. But in the sort of world that we live in, I think the ability to dissent in small change ways, not necessarily in large ways, the ability to think differently may actually be a survival skill. It may be as far from a luxury as you can imagine. Because we have today in society, in other words, has set in motion immense apparatuses for conformity, immense apparatuses that discipline us, that make us think like everyone else. So conformity is not in danger. Thinking like other people is not in danger. Even when this thinking like other people involves, like as your standard advertising campaign says that, think that you're unique. But every single person must be going around thinking that they're unique. So the language of it is only apparently contradictory. So there is an immense apparatus in place for making us think like others. So precisely because of this fact, we need little islands, small places, contexts in our lives where we learn how to think differently. And this is the final point I want to make in this set of arguments. Thinking differently doesn't necessarily come naturally. Innovative thinking is not, your standard brain wave in the middle of the night or something like that. It requires training. It requires that word, a very, very powerful word for me, which I think means a lot. It requires riyaz, disciplined practice. The countless hours that the Sachin Tendulkars of this world spend away from any camera, repetitively doing something endlessly, year after year, in order to produce on camera, on screen for us, all the magic that we see. Or take any field, anyone you admire, any type of performer you admire. There is, in every effortless performance, hidden behind it, is a history of practice, discipline. And that is what universities are in part supposed to give you. And if they are not giving it to you, you are being cheated. So the argument for useless knowledge, or the argument for learning how to dissent, is, I think, actually a distressingly hard-headed one. There's nothing romantic about it. It makes very good sense to learn how to dissent, to learn to appreciate things or to deal with things that are not immediately encashable or convertible into an immediate advantage. The reason why it is necessary to speak of these things today, both in our university and across the world, is that the attitude towards humanities and arts and other kinds of useless knowledges is now no longer that of a benign sin of omission. It's not just that institutions, states are neglecting to provide this knowledge. There is today a positive attempt to strangle these kinds of knowledge, to prevent them, to actually block them. And this is relatively new. To rename departments of history as departments of tourism, to convert mathematics schools into various forms of computers or IT and so on, these are, to my mind, extremely dangerous moves that really don't bode well at all for our collective future. And that is the reason why we need to not just talk about it, but actually do something to protect the small islands that are left, which actually do provide us this. More broadly, we have to learn to think of the university beyond its scholastic mission, beyond its strictly pedagogical or intra-classroom avatar. If each one of us thinks back to their time, or most of you, see, we already betrays my generation. Most of you don't have to think back, you are in university. Right? If you think about your time in the university, there will invariably be things that had nothing directly to do with the scholastic agenda, the academic agenda of the university, that have actually been life-changing for you. It's certainly true for me, and I'm sure it's true for lots of people. How is this possible? This is possible because a particular kind of life form is kept alive, is protected. And this life form is viewed generously. It's not viewed as a certification machine. It's not used as a narrow scholastic enterprise. And it produces, therefore, human beings who, through the fullness of that experience, only partially contained, partially and incompletely contained by the classroom, become adults, become citizens who are able to respond to their worlds. Just to give you a very, very stark sort of example, think of every single instance, famous instance, of what is referred to as honor killing in recent past, especially from the area around Delhi. An aspect of this that I constantly keep pointing out to people is that in every such story there is an unrecognized character. And that character is the college or the university. Almost every story of honor killing involves the college or university. It's because young women and young men had the opportunity to be in a public space that was legitimate. And for many from those social backgrounds, it was an historically unprecedented opportunity. This has nothing to do with what course they were doing, whether that course was vocational or not, and so on. But nevertheless, the university or the college, the higher educational institution, made possible, made available an environment where something they could be more than what they could be in their own environments, in the familiar environments that they came out of. Now clearly this is a very macabre example to give because honor killings are by definition tragedies. But nevertheless, they point to what is possible. They point to the power of these institutions and the amount of change, real change, that they are able to bring in lives where people feel able to stand up to things that they might not have perhaps done so before. So extrapolating from that, let us remember that the university is not only about what happens in the classroom. And the classroom should not only be about teaching employability, because true employability is unteachable, as it should be. Finally, the two problems to which I don't think anybody today has complete answers, but we would be being dishonest if we didn't acknowledge them as problems, as issues, as questions to be faced. And these are related issues. These are issues of accountability and elitism. These are both, I think, relevant issues that need to be considered. There is a sense in which higher education is naturally or necessarily elitist. Elitist in the sense that in order to come to college, you have to have passed through school. Logically, it doesn't make sense. Unless you have passed college, you can't enter university. And we know that in a country like ours, dropout rates in schools are such that there is a natural elitism to higher education, no matter what you do, just independent of everything else. I'm not really speaking of this kind of elitism. I'm speaking of the extra imposed or artificial elitism that also comes into institutions, over and above that which naturally accrues to a downstream educational institution like higher education. And in our context, we have a lot of that. Much of that happens through sheer class, that is to say how much it costs to actually be unemployed and fully occupied attending university, which is a privilege very few of us have. Even today, after what are considered to be inflated figures, but still, even today, for your generation, the gross enrollment ratio is just, according to the government, is 21%. That means to say, roughly 1 in 5 persons of your age group is here. 4 out of 5 of your cohort mates are not in university or college. So, this is a real thing. We are not talking about anything, in the air. So clearly, these issues should matter. But often, elitism is also used as a stick to beat the kind of education that conservatives don't like. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And this is the sense in which I think that finally, some form of accountability we have to think about. When we speak in defense of useless knowledge, we are refusing a particular kind of logic. We are refusing a cost-benefit analysis of the usual kind. We have the right to refuse this. We should be refusing this. That's what I'm saying. But this does not absolve us from rendering accounts in some larger way. This does not absolve us from the question of accountability. And we must come up with modes in which we can place ourselves, render ourselves accountable in whatever way that we wish to be rendered accountable. So we cannot say that ask us no more questions, that leave us to ourselves. We can't say that. We can argue about the terms